All right, so there was no doubt that Roosevelt gained significant influence in world affairs through the Panama Canal and all those adventures he had been a part of. So the Russo-Japanese War, when it came to an end, Roosevelt was asked to negotiate the treaty between the two countries. So he met with the Russian and Japanese representatives in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And there was an agreement reached. No president in U.S. history before Roosevelt had been asked to undertake such a task involving two other countries. And the Japanese, who had crushed Russia, was not entirely happy with the agreement. But Roosevelt's efforts made him the first U.S. president to actually receive the Nobel Peace Prize, which was further proof of the enhanced standing that the United States had worldwide. So, in order to really just nail this in, by 1907, near the end of his presidency, Roosevelt thought that the U.S. should show the world the strength of the U.S. Navy. Ships were all painted white above the waterline, and the fleet sailed into ports from South America to Australia and the Philippines. And in his mind, it was proof that the U.S. had reached a level of prestige which was as great as any European country, or as as a great power. Now, but the thing is that you have to really fully understand with this Great White Fleet. Yeah, okay, so they sail some ships around. No, this is so much bigger than that, because all of these ports that they sail in and out of, they have to be ready to have accommodations for all of these ships that are coming in. I mean, they don't just set out and have enough food and fuel and everything else for this massive journey that they take across the globe. So this really is a huge undertaking, and it's a 2-year undertaking of this fleet just going, and it's showing off the strength of the U.S. Navy. One of the songs of Great Britain, and it was released early, oh gosh, the song I know was around well before the Revolutionary War. But it talks about how a navy is just imperative to Great Britain to be able to have, and one of the reasons that is because they are this tiny island. But if you can be a nation as large as the United States and still have a huge navy, then that is kind of setting that tone for the United States to be a great world power, and that's what he's really showing with sending this Great White Fleet, and being able to make the accommodations of this was quite impressive. So that was definitely something that was quite impressive that he did. By the time the 1908 election rolled around, Roosevelt decided not to run for the presidency again. And he intended to endorse someone else. And he felt that this individual represented and could carry on the progressive philosophy, which was William Howard Taft, which you started reading about last week. Roosevelt and Taft did agree on most issues. Roosevelt's influence was such that the Republican Party did not go against his wishes, and Taft was nominated. Democrats offered up a familiar name again, which was William Jennings Bryan. And however, that populist allure had really started kind of waning somewhat once Roosevelt had come in office, and Taft did win a solid victory. For the most part, he really did follow that path that Roosevelt established. He attacked those trusts with even greater zeal than Roosevelt had, which we learned last week. All right, so by the 1912 election, assumed that Taft would be renominated by the Republican Party. Roosevelt had other ideas, and so he convinced a large number of his supporters that Taft was inadequate. The Republican Party, however, did not respond as Roosevelt had expected to putting himself forward as a candidate again. Taft seemed more in line with the party's social and economic policies at the time, and Roosevelt had taken his progressivism further than the progressives were actually comfortable with, and he stepped up his attacks on big business. He also talked about providing every U.S. citizen with universal health care. And think about how interesting that is. I mean, this happens over 100 years ago. People are already starting to get worked up about universal health care. And, Roosevelt starts talking about it back then. And it was definitely not something that the Republicans were comfortable with. Roosevelt stormed out of the convention when they had no interest in denying Taft a second term, and many declared support to him. So basically, what happens is Roosevelt formed a third party, the Progressive Party, which became known as the Bull Moose Party. And it really seemed to reflect Roosevelt's charging personality. The 1912 election ended up in a three-way race. And you've got Eugene Debs kind of as an outlier. He does represent the Socialist Party. Eugene Debs is a fascinating individual to read about. There's times he actually even runs from jail as president. But the three main contenders on this will be Wilson, Roosevelt, and Taft. And because there is that split between the Republican Party, Roosevelt did not win this by a sweeping victory, nor did Taft. They caused a divide in the Republican Party, which basically threw Wilson the presidency. So 1912, it kind of really depends on who you talk about or talk to. Some historians will say that 1912 marks the end of the progressive era. Wilson is perceived as a progressive, but he was very reluctant to push that policy or that philosophy with the enthusiasm that maybe those few presidents before him had. But there's reasons for that. I mean, you're looking at World War I. He's got certainly other things that are more pressing that he has to handle rather than looking at how much room do we give people of the United States. Public policy will often take a step back when faced with a war, especially a war of the magnitude that World War I is. Roosevelt did continue to make public appearances, and he encouraged a greater attention to the evils of big corporations, and he drew attention continually to the disparity between the rich and the poor. In 1918, he seemed to be preparing for another run at office for the 1920 election, but he was unexpectedly struck with illness and died in 1919. But the thing to really take away from Teddy Roosevelt is that he changed the presidency. He pushed the limits of the office, and he pushed those limits to the edge of the Constitution. And there were those who actually thought he had pushed it too far. There's no doubt that he established the foundation upon which President Franklin Roosevelt expanded the role of the federal government to the benefit of most Americans, that we'll talk about here in a couple of weeks. But Roosevelt did change the presidency in many ways. So if you have any questions, give me a shout this week. Ooh, I'm not sure what I just did there. Give me a shout this week, and feel free to ask. Don't forget, we've got spring break next week, so make it through the end of this module, and you will have a week off. So I look forward to hearing from you if you've got anything you need any help with.